Leeu Passant is really for Andrew and myself a very special and exciting project. Obviously, we're originally based in the Swartland, and all of our Mullineux wines are 100% Swartland wine of origin. And when we met Bas in 2014 or 13, it was such an exciting opportunity for Andrew and myself to venture outside of the Swartland and start a new project that was focused on these incredible vineyards outside of the Swartland. And really, I think what excited Andrew and myself is there was this growing awareness and interest in South African wineries and winemakers making authentically South African wine. And that's something that really resonates with us, to make something that's true to us, to our heritage, to our culture, to our terroir. And for us, really, that's what Leeu Passant is about. It's exploring the winelands of the Cape, finding really special vineyards and making them in a way that they can express themselves and express our culture and history in South Africa. So yeah, for us a really exciting and an awesome journey to be on. The wine that really kind of inspired and kicked off the whole project is the dry red, which we'll taste and talk about it at the end. But when we started the project, we wanted to make a really special white wine. And, Chardonnay has always been something that's really intrigued us. So Andrew and I started experimenting with quite a few Chardonnay vineyards from many different regions. We went as far afield as Barrydale in the Klein Karoo. There's some amazing terroirs there on slate. It's actually quite a cool climate. Worked with some fruit there. We went to Hemel en Aarde, to Elgin, to Kaimansgat, there in Villiersdorp. But we really fell in love with this one particular vineyard in Stellenbosch. And in 2015, we bottled 2 Chardonnays in the first vintage, one from Kaimansgat and one from Stellenbosch. But over the years, the Stellenbosch vineyard has just really captured our fascination, our interest, and yeah, it's a vineyard we just love working with. So we've from 2015 onwards been bottling the Stellenbosch vineyard. It's the same vineyard every year, so we haven't changed vineyards, and the same part of the vineyard. It's a vineyard on the Helderberg Mountain that's about 4 kilometers from the ocean, so quite a strongly maritime influence. And relatively high. It's just under 400 meters above sea level. So a fantastically cool site that's just got great, a long growing season, a very cool growing season that allows us to pick Chardonnay that has lovely ripe flavors, but not crazily high in alcohol. So it's a wine with a lot of intensity, but a really balanced intensity. I'll pull up a couple of pictures of the vineyards quickly and the map just to show you where they are. So Andrew, maybe just talk about the soils, what makes this site special, and also what is the winemaking that goes into it before we chat about the vintages and the wine.
Yeah, so the vineyard in Stellenbosch on the Helderberg, as Chris mentioned, the soils are, it's a little bit of decomposed sandstone off of the top of the mountains, but it has this rich gravelly clay that just helps so much with giving it this deep texture. So you're getting the sunshine bringing texture by having a little bit more sunshine and depth on the grapes, but also the soils themselves and the way that the richer soils contribute to the way the fruit tastes really is one of the essence of terroir in this vineyard. But even stronger than the soil, because we're always talking about soil with Mullineux and with our granite and schist and iron soils, but stronger than the soil in this vineyard is the climate. The maritime climate of this vineyard overrides the soil. So you do get definitely the richness in the wine from the soil, but those long, cool days and nights, as Chris was talking about, you end up with just this insane zesty acidity, this liminess, this flintiness, and that for me is the essence of the vineyard. But of course, capturing that South African and that Stellenbosch sunshine.
Well, Stellenbosch is really much more diverse than what you think. So if you think of the Helderberg, it's really close to False Bay. and False Bay has a very strong maritime influence. Polka Dry is quite similar. So Polka Dry is the mountain towards, I suppose, Kales River, towards Cape Town side. Also very strongly influenced by False Bay, on the False Bay side of the mountain. And if you go further in, so when you get to Stellenbosch Mountain and Simonsberg, it actually gets quite a bit warmer. When you think of Stellenbosch Chardonnay, it's a way more diverse style than what I think a lot of people realize. And particularly the style that we get off the Helderberg really excites us, because we're able to pick, as I said earlier, Chardonnay that's ripe, but has an incredibly vibrant acidity and a great freshness at the same time. So, yep. So, Andrea, let's chat about the vintages. We're going to start with 2015, guys. So hopefully you've all got your mini bottles with you that were painstakingly bottled. And we're going to start with the older vintages and work through to the younger vintages.
And I'll just mention the winemaking, because that does stay the same between these. So it's the same vineyard, the same winemaking, and you're just going to really taste vintage variation in this flight, which I think is always incredibly exciting to really know a site very, very well, and just taste the seasonal changes. Because a lot of times in Europe, they think that in the Southern Hemisphere or in warmer climates that we don't have vintage variation, but we absolutely do, and you're about to taste it. So the grapes are all picked around the same ripeness from year to year. For us, what's super important is we wait for the acidity to actually tone down a bit, which is the opposite of the Swartland, where we're trying to conserve acidity. So you're still going to have a very zesty acidity in these wines. But what that does is that allows us to make the style of Chardonnay that we adore. So there is a bit of winemaker influence in this, because we chose which direction the Chardonnay was going to go into. And that's making that much more saline, flinty style, not a lot of primary characteristics. So, no obvious, peach or apple characters in it, but definitely much more on the mineral and textural side. So we love drinking those Chardonnays. We think they go the best with food. We think that some of the most world-class Chardonnays, no matter where you are, have that more mineral edge as opposed to a fruity Chardonnay. They're all barrel fermented and barrel aged. They live for the first 18 months without any sulfur at all. So when the grapes come in, they're pressed oxidatively. We intentionally make the juice look deep brown. And the idea there is that you're oxidizing out any potential phenolics that could oxidize later in the wine. So this style of wine is also really known to be incredible aging. It has the most aging potential for white wine when you do the oxidation in the juice phase. It goes to barrel. We don't do anything to protect or prevent from malolactic fermentation. And then when it's finished with its fermentations, we keep the barrels topped. We leave them on the lees for post-fermentation protection, but we don't do any lees stirring. So all the texture you're tasting in this wine is from the grapes itself. It's not from any manipulation. And then after 18 months, then we'll blend the wine and get it ready for bottling. So that is consistent completely through all 5 of these wines that you're going to try.
So yeah, so same vineyard, same block, same winemaking. So really, we're going to be tasting vintage variation to a large degree between these wines.
Great. So 2015, we'll go through one vintage at a time. So 2015 was known in South Africa as the Goldilocks vintage. It was not too hot, not too cold, not too wet, not too dry. And it was such a fantastic vintage for South Africa because it had those characteristics, those weather and growing characteristics, not just in Stellenbosch, not just in the Swartland, but all over the winelands and for all varieties as well. So in the wines coming out of 2015, it's really, South Africa was really picking up internationally in terms of a wine region to desire and to watch. And what's fantastic is some of the best wines came out of 2015. So I think that has really helped the global attention of South Africa, and people have then focused in on regions and on varieties that they appreciate. So we love the 2015 Chardonnays. coming out of Stellenbosch particularly. And this is when we realized that this vineyard is incredible.
Yeah. Maybe, Andrew, just quickly before we move on to the next wine, how do you change maybe your approach with Chardonnay in Stellenbosch versus Chenin in the Swartland? Are there any differences between the two?
So Chardonnay absolutely adores oxygen, and it works really well with oxygen. It creates sort of a trifecta with oak as well. So when Chardonnay is young, some oak characters might be more apparent, but when you taste this 2015, there's almost no hint of oak. It has completely integrated with the wine. It moves it into that more mineral direction. It works so well with the oxygen in its youth. So that really works well together. Chenin likes oxygen, but they're not lovers. You know, they get along. They're like cousins, and they like to hang out and they have a lot of fun together. But we don't force too much oxygen in Chenin because you can end up with that kind of more bruised character. And then the same with the oaking in the Chenin. We're much more hands off with Chenin. You have to be very, you know, it's only large format that we work with, and predominantly neutral oak. Whereas Chardonnay, it really enhances the wine. And that's what, when working with oak and with barrels, it should be something that enhances the wine and is an amazing vessel for aging the wine, but it should never by any means dominate the wine.
Yeah, so for me, 2015 is it's a very special vintage. When we first released it, the wine had a slight, like quite a flinty, salty character that was quite prevalent. There was a bit of fruit in the background, but I find right now that's harmonized a lot, and it's still there, that slight kind of struck match character, but it's really well balanced with the citrus elements that's coming out, a bit of stone fruit. Yeah, so I think it's in a really fantastic place, and yeah, it just shows that this wine has got a really long life ahead of it. So let's move on to the 2016. Andrea, what happened in 2016?
So 2016 was the beginning of the Great Western Cape drought, which has now spread to a lot of other parts of South Africa as well. It was the hottest, driest year on record in the Cape Winelands. In the Cape Winelands, and what it did was absolutely shock the vineyards because they were growing as per normal. The 2015 spring was a pretty normal growing season, you know, maybe a bit drier, but nobody was prepared, including the vines, for the 2016, you know, early summer and into harvest, where we were hit with really hot, dry weather. But these vines are very established. They're almost 30 years old. You find just with more established vineyards, and especially ones that are farmed naturally, you know, in harmony with what they need and not a farmer forcing things upon them, that vineyards are incredibly self-regulating. So the vines, before we even knew it, realized that they wouldn't be able to handle a huge crop load. So they self-regulated by naturally dropping off some fruit. What happens is, over the course of about 3 to 5 days, the clusters that it knows that it won't be able to ripen, it actually turns them into these hard little pellets of raisins, and it drops them to the ground. So it's really quite incredible. So pretty small yield. It was our smallest yield by far in 2016. But what you end up with is more natural concentration. It's, for me, an incredibly textural wine. The acidity is down a little bit, as you would expect, but the texture and the finesse of it, there is finesse because there's balance between the texture and the acid.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, so quite amazing. You know, this was the first year of the drought, and we particularly saw it in the Swartland with our fruit here, where some of our vineyards were 80% down in yield, some were even more. So you knew it was an extremely stressful year. But here in this site, because it was so cool, it was dry, but it wasn't stressful in terms of the temperature. So you get a slightly, or a bit more concentration, a bit more texture in the wine. But I think with the same vibrancy and energy you get in the 15 and right through the wine. So yeah, really showing the vintage, which we want. But I think doing it in a way that's super balanced and still incredibly fresh and age worthy. So yeah.
And it ended up getting Platter's Chardonnay of the Year. So it was, that balance was recognized, not just by us, but by publications as well.
Yeah. And Annika and Peter are just mentioning, incredible freshness on the 2015. We completely agree. It's for us a very special wine and very special vintage. So, and you'll see when we start tasting the slightly younger vintages, they have the same freshness to them, but just need a little bit more time for everything to integrate, I suppose. So I think the 15, 16, and we're going to move now on to the 17 really shows. I think the 17 is at a point where it's just starting to be really approachable for enjoying.
And these awesome little bottles, I can't see the label there, but we filled them as carefully as possible, with inert gas. There shouldn't have been any excessive oxygen uptake, but even then it's not the perfect storage vessel, especially since, the bottle's been decanted into it. No matter how careful you are, you're actually still having a somewhat decanted experience. And I think what that's doing is it's showing the wine and how it's actually going to taste actually in a year or two, maybe, by having it this way and shipping it. So I think it's actually a great way to taste these wines, because they will be a little bit more open right now than they will be if you're pulling the cork for the first time.
So Wayne just asking a question about the production
volume. So 2016 is higher than 2015 in spite of the drought. So 2015 was still our time when we were getting to know all the vineyards, working with quite a few vineyards. And 2015 is the year that we decided we wanted to focus on this Stellenbosch vineyard. So it's not a vineyard we own; it's a vineyard we lease, and we've got good long-term control over the vineyard. But after 2015, we decided, yes, this is the vineyard we want to focus on. So I think we were previously renting about 10 rows, and we've now grown that to quite a bit more. So it's grown because we're working with more of the block. But Chardonnay particularly is a very interesting grape. You'll see it in the 17 and 18. It's very susceptible to wind and very susceptible to also cold in the winter. So yields of Chardonnay are quite unpredictable. You can have great weather conditions, but there might have been bad wind on a certain day, and then the yields will drop very quickly. So it's a really interesting grape, or sometimes frustrating grape to work with because there's not a lot of fruit. But really interesting quality-wise.
Yeah, I mean, 2019 especially was we'll talk about it with ours, but it was particularly finicky with wind in the whole of the Western Cape. But we'll talk about that more later.
Cool. Yeah, and thanks, Kathy. I agree. 2015 and 2016 are showing lovely. 2016 definitely more textural, more creamy, but still has that lovely energy to it. So so let's taste the 2017. There you go. 2017 was also Chardonnay of the Year in the Platter's Guide. So again, a fantastic vintage for us. This, as I said, is now the third vintage, and I think this is just starting to hit that kind of open phase in the drinking window. So Andrea, what happened in this vintage? What was unique about it?
Yeah, 2017 was incredible because it was after just 1 year after the vineyard, even though it was still dry. It wasn't as hot as 2016, but it was definitely a bounce back year. Yields were up. The yields were up in the Chardonnay particularly, and that had to do with the springtime temperatures and lack of wind during flowering. And we did have lower night temperatures during the growing season, which just helped to push the harvest a little bit longer, a little bit slower. So there's, again, that bounce back in acidity as well. What's quite interesting, though, is these wines weren't picked any riper, but the imbalance that you get from a drought doesn't just affect acidity. I mean, that's the obvious thing that it affects, or the sugar, but it affects actually the type of sugar. Everyone knows I'll get a little bit geeky in every single seminar. So it's not just sucrose in a wine, it's glucose and fructose, plus a bunch of other unfermentable sugars, but the two main sugars are glucose and fructose. And yeast love glucose. They don't really like fructose. You actually need glucose to ferment fructose. So I always compare it to, a child that has, broccoli and fish fingers on a dinner plate, they're going to very rarely go for the broccoli first, and the broccoli is the fructose. So sometimes when it's done fermenting all the glucose, there's a little bit of fructose left. And we're very, very happy that the yeast fermented everything. But when you have more fructose, you tend to have a slightly higher alcohol as well. But it doesn't have a burny feel. So this is the higher alcohol of our Chardonnays, but it is, for me, still incredibly balanced. And that's because we didn't pick it riper. It's just the yeast had a different conversion for the year. And that's the phenomenon of, winemaking. There's still so much that we can't control, even as a winemaker or as a viticulturalist. There's so much of nature that has its own plan. So that's part of the vintage.
Yeah. But I think stylistically, the 2017 is in a way quite similar to the 2015. So 2016 had a bit more maybe body texture to it. 2017 is again a slightly tighter style, a little bit more linear. And I agree with Johan, it's got a really racy acidity to it. This for us is a really amazing vineyard. As Andrea said just now, we have to wait to be able to pick this vineyard because the acidity is so high. When we go and taste samples in the grape samples in the vineyard, it's sometimes painful to do because there's so much acidity it like burns your mouth. So it's a vineyard where we really have to wait for that acidity to calm down. Yeah, I'll age like Meryl Streep, that very gracefully, with a lot of character. So I agree. So personally, I think 2017, you'll see is I think just in an absolutely beautiful place right now. Whereas, I see we're slowing down here, so hopefully you guys can hear us all. Whereas, a year ago it was still tasting a little bit tight, and it's, I think, now in an absolutely fantastic place. Great. So, Andrea, let's move on to the 2018.
We have to finish our glasses.
So we'll taste 2018 next.
So in 2018, so cooler days, warmer nights. There was definitely higher disease pressure in general in 2018. So when you have to wait to pick a vineyard, you can be watching that. In 2018, there was definitely a rain that was coming. We were able to pick it just in time before the rain came. So we're very happy with that. And obviously with white wines, you have a little bit more leeway than with red wines, because you do tend to pick white wines earlier in the season, or the white grapes earlier in the season. And just a massive recovery on all fronts. I mean, the acid alcohol textural balance, I'm absolutely thrilled with.
Yeah, so 2018 again is I think a wine that has a little bit more weight to it. There was a bit of wind in the season, so yields again a little bit lower. So a little bit more natural concentration in the wine. But you'll start to see the wine is getting a bit tighter. So whereas the 2017 I think is in a very, very beautiful place right now, the 2018 is a little bit more tight, and you'll see that again with the 2019. So Colleen is asking here, was the oaking any different in 2018?
So the oaking is identical in all of the vintages. And I always say you can't have 2015 without having the 18 and 19. So you'll see that the oak definitely shows more when it's super young. But that just integrates over, takes about 3 years, and then it's completely integrated in. So the 2015 tasted very similar to the 2019, I would say. For me, the 16 and the 18 have a lot of similarities texturally. And then the 15, 17, and the 19, which we'll have next, have this similar kind of raciness and linearity.
Kathy's just asking a question about how the drought affected Stellenbosch and Swartland. We can chat a lot more detail, but essentially Swartland just experienced it in a much more intense way. Stellenbosch, a lot of Stellenbosch has about 700-800 millimeters of rain a year. Swartland, where we are, is about 400, and 400 is really marginal for viticulture. So if we have less than that, it becomes, really a challenge. Whereas Stellenbosch, they went from 700 down to 450, so they were still okay. Whereas in the Swartland, it was way more extreme. Yeah. So yeah, we can chat in more detail about it.
But it's all relative. So if a vineyard's used to 400 and it gets 300, it handles it almost the same way that a vineyard that has 1,000, going down to 800. So yeah, the dryland vineyards definitely are kind of used to it. They bounce back faster. We saw some irrigated vineyards out there that really took the biggest pounding in the drought years because they didn't know how to handle what was happening above the surface.
Yeah, and this vineyard has irrigation. It has drip irrigation, but we use it as supplementary. So it's really, if there is a very warm or a very windy spell that comes, they will use a little bit of drip irrigation on it. Yeah. All right, so on to the new release, the 2019 a vintage we're really very, very excited about. I think it's a vintage that resonates with the 2015 and 2017 quite closely, very similar in style. So yeah, maybe Andrea, just chat about what this vintage was about and how it relates to the style of the wine.
Yeah, so we in spring of 2018 had a lot of wind again, and but our vineyards were not nearly as damaged. It doesn't take wind to like break the vineyard. It's just when it happens during flowering with Chardonnay, that each flower makes a grape. And when you have windy vineyards, even extra breezy during flowering with Chardonnay, it's super susceptible to not make that grape at all because the flower just blows off. So around the Western Cape, the Chardonnay yields were down incredibly. I mean, we heard of up to 90% in other regions. So we were only down like not that much, but we were definitely affected by the wind. But with the lower yields, and then we ended up having warm days and cooler nights. So that led to beautiful, even ripening for both the reds and the whites. But yeah, just absolutely overall tremendous quality in the 2019 because they were low yields and then very even ripening in the growing season.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's analytically, if you look at it, again, very similar to the 2017 and 2015. But again, I find this wine, as you would want and expect, is really showing it's very tightly wound, very tightly knit, and it's got a nice, lovely racy acidity. So I think another Meryl Streep vintage, but this is much younger Meryl Streep. Yeah. So yeah, so this the 2019 is the vintage we're releasing now. I think I mentioned earlier the wines will be released on the 18th of June, so in a week's time. For any private customers, please get in touch with KO. If you're looking for an allocation ahead of time, you're welcome to email him. And trade customers, please get a hold of Nicola. So I'm aware of time. A few people have said that they do need to get on, so we are going to move on to the reds. Just a question: why does the acidity seem to drop in the even years? I think that's just coincidence. If you look long term, it's probably not going to be the same. 2016 was literally the first year of the drought, so there's a bit more concentration to kind of go with the acidity, and 2018 was, because of the wind, quite a little bit more stressful vintage. So again, a little bit more texture to go with the acidity. So I don't think it's going to happen every year, but it's worked out that way. That the 2015, 17, and 19 have been slightly tighter, more linear, and 16 and 18 a bit more broad and textured, for sure.
But as humans, we are conditioned to naturally see patterns and things, and I love that.
Yeah. Cool. Great. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the next flight, which is the two Cinsaults. We'll first taste the Wellington Cinsault, 2018, and then the Franschhoek Cinsault, and then the Stellenbosch Cabernet. So moving on to the Wellington Cinsault. So this for us is an extremely special vineyard. It's the oldest registered red wine vineyard in the country. It was planted in 1900. So I'm not sure if you guys know the history of South African wine, but we had a louse, kind of a bug that came into the Cape in about 1870 that destroyed all of the vineyards in the Cape. And the farmers and the industry got together, and they managed to find a solution, which was to graft onto American rootstocks and restart the industry from about 1900. So there's not many vineyards. There's a handful that are planted before 1900 left in the country, but the majority were planted after 1900. So this is one of the very, very first of those vineyards that were replanted. And it's a Cinsault vineyard. So Cinsault was the variety that was planted to kind of get the industry going again. It's a variety that makes big bunches, big volumes of grapes when it's young. And that's ideal for trying to kickstart the industry again. And what's amazing, though, is when the vines age, when they get really old, the yields come down, the bunches get smaller, the berries get smaller, and you get these extremely profound wines. So this is one of these really special old Cinsault vineyards that we're very, very fortunate and honored to be able to work with. So I think this is your favorite vine in the whole vineyard, right, Andrea?
Yeah. So when you have these amazing old vineyards, each vine takes on its own complete physical structure. You know, when something's 120 years old, you know, it does develop its own physical characteristics as well. And you know, you end up having favorite vines that you're just drawn to. And you know, the same way Chris and I look different, each of these vines looks different as well. And
so yeah, so Wynand's just asking, why is the vineyard called Passant? We just named it after the farmer, or he's now the landowner, because we do all the farming. But yeah, we name it after the guy who owns the vineyard. His name is Mr. Passant. So yeah, so this vineyard is planted in a really interesting site. It's in the alluvial plains of Wellington, so very close to the Berg River. And what's really interesting is in the alluvial plains, it's very deep sandy soils. And those soils are actually what has allowed this vineyard to get so old. It's you know, very, very deep soils that has a water table about 3-4 meters down. And the vine's roots just go down there and are able to get moisture. So that's really one of the factors that's allowed these vineyards to go through droughts, to go through really tough cycles, and become really interesting and really old. Maybe Andrew, chat about the winemaking that goes into the Cinsault and how that relates to the taste of the wine.
yes. So with deep roots, you end up with bigger canopies. And so this will naturally just have this sort of longer, fresher feel, but the age of it is what's giving it these incredible tannins. You know, it has these long, linear, quite structured tannins, actually. You know, it's so to respect the vineyard and the age of the vineyard, we actually want to enhance that. So we are working with 100% crushed full cluster, and of course, only working with the indigenous yeast that have also been developing over the last 120 years on this vineyard. And you know, with that, with the whole cluster fermentation, it's like putting a magnifying glass on the vineyard. You know, it's part of the vine that's going in the fermentation itself. So it's definitely going to enhance the tannins. It's going to make it tighter. But even though we do age it for 2 years in barrel and then another year in bottle, again, to respect the vineyard, because there's a lot of beautiful, very fragrant, almost juicy, lighter Cinsaults out there. But this is such a special vineyard. We wanted to push it a little bit further. And that's why we do extended macerations, meaning we leave it on the skin to really develop those tannins. We leave it in the barrel longer. We leave it in the bottle longer. So it's not going to be this, you know, primary tutti frutti Cinsault. It's definitely more serious and a very sophisticated Cinsault. But with time, you're not going to get those juicy aromatics that come out of it like you do from young and vibrant Cinsauts. What you get out of this are those deeper, darker, like violet characteristics out of this Cinsault.
And Kathy makes a good point. No, this is it's a very special vineyard, but it for us takes a lot of work. It's a vineyard we took over in 2014. It's not a big block. It's only about 0.8 of a hectare. In the first vintage, we only got about 600 kilograms of the whole block. So, really minuscule yields. But we've done a lot of work. We've really put a lot of love and attention into this vineyard. And over the years, we've been able to get it into a slightly more stronger, more healthier state. And we're now getting about 3 tons out of the vineyard every year. So it's a nice yield, and it's amazing to see these 100-year-old vines, 120-year-old vines that are still giving us 3 tons, which is about 4 tons a hectare, it's amazing. Really, yeah, it's a testament to what you can do if you put a lot of love and care into something. So yeah, very special site that we're extremely happy and honored to be working with. Yeah, I think you're right. It's very precise, very pure. Looking at it, it's got lovely color. It's not a deep dark wine. I think if you ever have a deep dark Cinsault, something else has been blended into it. It's always going to be slightly more ethereal, but it's still serious. It's got great tannin, great structure. And to Wynand's question, yeah, these Cinsauts will age incredibly well. Cinsault is quite an interesting variety. As good Cinsauts, when they age, they start to get a bit rounder, a bit more concentrated. There's almost this like glycerol, it's almost a sweetness that starts to come up. But I'm talking 40, 50 years down the line. So yeah, we believe this wine will age incredibly well.
There are some incredible examples of old Cinsault in South Africa because of its history, and how predominant it was in viticulture for a long time in South Africa. So there's a lot of great examples out there. And then in terms of international buyers reacting to Cinsault, it is still a relatively niche wine, but in terms of, old vines around the world, I mean, some of the oldest vines in California are Cinsault. You have these incredible old Cinsauts in the south of France. And so I think the old Cinsauts really, really attract a lot of attention because of its ageability and because of how just interesting and serious they become as they age.
Cool. Great. So I think, yeah, we're going to taste next the Franschhoek Cinsault. So this is another old Cinsault vineyard. The Wellington Cinsault is the oldest red wine vineyard in the country. This is the second oldest. So we're very lucky to be working with the 2 oldest red wine vineyards in the country. Quite a different site, in fact. This is a vineyard that's planted on the, sorry, there we go. Wellington Franschhoek. This is a vineyard that's planted on the lower kind of slopes of Franschhoek Mountain. I'll share a picture of that soon as well for you guys. So these are soils that are much richer in clay. They're much heavier soils than the alluvial soils of the previous wine. So although this vineyard is younger, it's planted in 1932. It's actually, for me, a wine that has a little bit more density to it. It's a wine with a little bit more natural weight, concentration, texture from these slightly heavier soils. So Andrea, is there a difference in how the wines are made, these 2 Cinsauts, or?
Yeah, so when it comes to respecting site, we'd like to make it identically. And so therefore these wines are both 100% crushed whole cluster. And again, with indigenous yeast. So the indigenous yeast will be different on those 2 vineyards. When people talk about natural yeast or ambient yeast, it's the yeast that naturally grow on the grapes. And those are fine-tuned to the environmental factors, to the moisture, the sunshine, the natural nutrients on the skins of the grapes. So the yeast from these 2 vineyards will be completely different strains.
Yep. So here I'm just going to screen share again. So I think I've got it. I've got it right now. So this is the vineyard in Franschhoek. So you'll see it's on the on the sort of lower slopes of the Franschhoek Mountain. Again, yeah, for us, really a very special and a vineyard that's a privilege to work in. It's a vineyard that's really interesting because I suppose the best word in Afrikaans is a mengelmoes. It's really a mixed up vineyard. There are really no straight rows in this, straight like lines in this vineyard, because it was planted and farmed from the go with horses. So there's no space for a tractor to drive in this vineyard. It's always, since the day that it was planted, farmed by hand. So for us, it's a really special heritage vineyard. Tepang is just asking what are the leading regions for Cinsault? It's quite an interesting question. There are there's Cinsault planted in many places because it was the grape that was planted to revive our industry. And when we taste the dry red, a lot of Cinsault blend with Cabernet for a long time. So there's actually Cinsault all over the show. There's a lot of it in Swartland. It's in Franschhoek. There's some in Stellenbosch. There's a lot of it in Paarl. So it's found pretty widely. Yeah.
And internationally, it's found in typical Mediterranean climates. So in the south of France, in Chile, there's actually some amazing old vine Cinsault in Chile, in California as well. Yeah. And it's all celebrated for its ageability in the vineyard.
Yeah, yeah. And it's never going to make a big, dense, blockbuster wine. I think people who want that style of wine need to be looking for something else. But it can make profound, serious wines from old vines. Yeah. But yeah, so yeah, I think just really this picture just shows you how incredible this vineyard is. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, so I find on the nose there's a little bit more like sort of Christmas spice, dark fruit, a little bit more density on the palate here. So identical winemaking, same vintage, just a different site that really reflects itself in this wine. Yeah, so next we're going to move on to Stellenbosch again, to Cabernet Sauvignon. When we started the dry red, or the Leeu Passant project, and we're working with the dry red, we worked with a lot of Cabernet vineyards, which is a very important component. So we've got to know Cabernet very well, and we've really fallen in love with Cabernet in, I suppose, the cooler parts of Stellenbosch. So some places that are very close to where the Chardonnay is planted. So this is a Cabernet that's not a single vineyard Cabernet. It's a Cabernet that's a blend of 3 or 4 different vineyards, but all in the area close to False Bay. So I'm going to pour some for Andrea here. Mm-hmm. Andrea, why do we like working with Cab in those areas?
Yeah, we absolutely adore the more classical style of Cabernet. So you're going to get more tea characters, more cedar, that pencil lead, but not in that crazy dense way. It's a very sophisticated Cabernet. So from the cooler sites of Stellenbosch, and you'll taste that coolness in there. We wanted to make a Cabernet that just worked so well with food, worked so well with conversation, and really was inspired by the more traditional styles of Cabernet that you used to find in Stellenbosch.
Yeah. So I'm just going to show you the map now that I've got the screen share. I think I've got it working. So yeah, this is what I was trying to explain earlier. So this is the Stellenbosch wine region here, so close to Cape Town. In the grand scheme of things, it's not a massive region, but it's very, very diverse. If you think Paarl is just here to the north of Stellenbosch, Franschhoek is here slightly to the east. Elgin is obviously very different. It's high altitude and very maritime influenced also in the south here. But Stellenbosch is really interesting because it's way more diverse than what a lot of people realize. So the closer you are to False Bay here, the more of a maritime influence there is. It's in the days much cooler. The nights, interestingly, are cool as well, but it's a much more moderate temperature. So there's a little bit less day to night variation, but it's definitely more consistently cool. And this is where Helderberg is, just here. The Polka Dry Hills are just here. And there's an area called Fir Grove, which is where Leriche is, Ken Forrester, they're situated here. So this is very much where our Cabernet is coming from. It's a few vineyard sites, all very close to False Bay over here. And then if you go further inland, you get to the Stellenbosch Hills, to Simonsburg, and then to Botteleray. So it's still the same appellation, still the same wine region, and you're not going far. You're going 5-6 kilometers, but there's very quickly a very big difference in the climate. It starts to get a little bit warmer in the day. There's more of a diurnal shift between the two, the days and nights. And I think there's really a big difference between the two. So we love working with Chardonnay down here, but also Cabernet, because it's a place where Cabernet has a long, slow growing season. We can pick Cabernet quite late in the season without a ton of sugar, which means we don't have a super high alcohol and a lot of extract. So it really lets us make a Cabernet that has great balance, freshness, and elegance to it. So a very classic, fresh, vibrant style of Cabernet that we're looking for.
And so we're treating each site differently in the winery because we want it to reflect the vineyard itself. So for example, Fir Grove with the, deeper soils, and that's where our oldest vines are coming from. And with that oldness, with the old vines, you're going to have more tannin. With the deeper soils, you're also going to have more acidity. So with tannin and acidity, the wines tend to need more oxygen in the fermentation process. And then on the Polka Dry, you're going to end up with what you have more granite soil. So we get more of the slightly more structured Cabernets coming out of the granitic soils in the Polka Dry, but in that cool tannin way that we often talk about, that sort of minty tannin kind of character that you get. Yep. And then the Helderberg, being cooler and slightly higher altitude, takes a lot longer to ripen. And we're in quite a cool pocket in the Helderberg as well. So there you can actually have quite thick skins. So there again, we have to handle those grapes differently in the winery as well. Because if we treated them all the same, you're not going to respect any single site to its maximum capacity. And we'd like to use the different sites as blending components.
Yeah. Maybe Andrea, just a quick one. Dave is just asking here about your Californian history or heritage. Maybe what's the difference between the style we're making and what you would have been making in California, and what are the different styles in California? Because I think California is way more diverse than I think what a lot of people realize.
Yeah, in the 90s and early 2000s, California became famous for its really big Cabernets. But I think we forget how long ago the early 2000s were. It feels like yesterday. And there's definitely people still making that style, but there's a whole generation of the next generation of winemakers that are also aiming for those more classical styles, aiming for the slightly more, mountain tannins and the cooler style of tannins that you can get in Cabernet in California. In California, inherently, there's more primary fruit. That's just the nature of the soil. They have very young soils there. We have very old soils here. So our Cabernets are going to always be a little bit more spicy and in a positive herbaceousness to it. I like how we get almost like a bergamot character in ours, like that Earl Grey orange zest kind of in ours. So that's, the difference between South African and Californian Cabernet, but also there's a generational shift absolutely as well.
Cool. Yeah, and Johan, they're saying the Cab for him tastes like a super Tuscan or a Tuscan wine. I think that it's a really interesting compliment because we're pretty much obsessed with wines of Tuscany at the moment.
And their balance of tannin.
Yeah, the tannin specifically, this wonderful dryness without being aggressive, the sophisticated tannin. So yeah, thank you very much. That's a great compliment. Thank you. Cool. So yeah, I think the Cabernet is for us a very exciting wine. It's obviously Stellenbosch is the home of Cabernet in South Africa. It's a region where Cabernet does extremely well. And this is an expression of a specific part of Stellenbosch. So it's the kind of False Bay part of Stellenbosch, which for us is slightly cooler, slightly longer growing season. So yeah, for us a very special wine that comes at I think a really good price as well. Cool. So yeah, we're now going to move on to the dry red, and we're going to start with the 2015 vintage, and then taste through to the younger vintages. So I'm going to pour first the 2015, and I've got it in my glass already. Andrew, you're right for the moment. We can share. Oh, you're right. Okay, cool.
I brought out a spittoon in the meantime.
You don't have to drive anywhere. Yes, so the dry red, as I said earlier, was really the wine that inspired the whole Leeu Passant project. I think that what the Swartland did really well was get people, winemakers in South Africa, excited to make authentically Swartland wines that spoke about the Swartland region, and that's filtered out, I suppose, into other winemakers in other areas as well. And it's really exciting now to see that winemakers are focusing on what works in their place and focusing on that. But there's also this amazing pride in making wine that's South African. We're not trying to copy other regions or make wines that taste like Bordeaux or Burgundy or whatever. We're making wines that taste like where we come from, South African or Swartland or Stellenbosch. And also what's great is we have this amazing history and heritage and culture in the Western Cape that we should also be celebrating. And the dry red is really our wine that's really championing that. So back in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, there were these incredible wines that were made that were blends of Cabernet Sauvignon and Cinsault. Wines that spring to mind are Chateau Libertas, Rustenburg Dry Red, Alto Rouge, even Zonneblom Cabernet was Cabernet, but it was actually a Cinsault Cabernet blend. So really, there were these amazing wines that if you're able to find a bottle of Chateau Libertas, pretty much from any vintage in the 60s or 70s, and even the early 80s, it's going to be amazing. The same with Rustenburg Dry Red or Alto. And we kind of forgot about them for maybe a couple of decades, but we really believe they're wines that really speak to something special and authentically South African. So yeah, the dry red is our modern interpretation of these incredible wines. So yeah, so Andrea, maybe just chat about what are the threads that go from the past into the present?
Absolutely. So in our kind of intimate expression of these South African wines, we wanted to connect the past with what's happening now. Because to just do a imitation of what happened previously wouldn't do the wine justice either. It would be as bad as trying to imitate another country. So what we wanted to do was take these golden threads and bring them into the future. And what those golden threads were, Cabernet and Cinsault. And the Cab Cinsault based blends were sort of a happy accident. Cabernet was really small berries in South Africa in the vineyards, and the equipment in the winery was very rudimentary, and the Cabernet would get stuck in the equipment. So people started adding Cinsault, which is big and juicy, especially in its youth, as a lubricant. And so these Cab Cinsault based blends were born. And so what ended up happening over time, though, was they would take a Cabernet vineyard and plant Cinsault on the end rows. So naturally, there was a bit of Cinsault in the system. So we knew that it had to be Cab Cinsault, and we knew that a portion of it had to be co-fermented as well, because that is the way they did it. We knew that working with larger format oak, especially large upright vats, would be definitely something that we could resonate working with, because that's how we work quite a bit, especially with the Mullineux Syrah. But a lot of these wines also blended in at least a third variety. Some it was Pinotage, some it was Tinta Barocca. But we felt that there is amazing scope for Cabernet Franc in South Africa, and that Cabernet Franc, even as a single variety, has just an amazing future in South Africa. So we decided that we wanted our modern interpretation was going to be Cabernet Cinsault and Cabernet Franc, partially co-fermented, working a lot with larger format oak. But we always joke around with better knowledge of cellar hygiene, because they didn't necessarily know what bad bacteria and yeast were, 50, 70, 80 years ago.
Yeah. So it's really, taking the previous three wines, those incredible Cinsault vineyards, taking the incredible Cabernet that we're working with, and blending them together with this amazing Cabernet Franc from the Helderberg, and really all of those together make something that's way more than 1 + 1 + 1 = 3. You get this incredible wine that has perfume, the structure, the fragrance of the Cinsault, this incredible density and firmness from the cab, this amazing perfume, the bergamot character that Andrew was chatting about from the Cab Franc. So all of these things together in one wine just works really incredibly well. And for us, this wine is a journey. We don't have a recipe or a formula that it's always going to be the same percentages of the three varieties. It will vary from vintage to vintage, depending on the conditions. But yeah, it's really for us a fantastic wine that really speaks about authentically South African heritage and wine. So yeah, 2015 was the very first vintage. That's the wine we have in our glass here. I think it's a wine that we were extremely excited to release, because it was, as Andrew said earlier, the Goldilocks vintage. It was a vintage that was just really, really perfect everywhere, whether it was in Stellenbosch or Franschhoek or Wellington. And it's kind of a third of each of the three varieties. And I think, yeah, it's showing incredibly well at the moment. These are obviously wines that we believe are going to age remarkably and incredibly well. They have quite a lot of structure and tannin to them, so they are wines that do need a bit of time, either in the bottle or in a decanter or in the glass to open up. But I think this really shows the potential of the dry red.
Yeah, and because it was that Goldilocks vintage, it was really perfect for being able to do a third blend, because each of those varieties ripened so beautifully. And when I spoke about co-fermentation earlier, it's, with parcels that we know will work together. But first of all, they have to ripen at the same time. So there was one of the Cab and one of the Cinsault portions that ripened at the same time. Cinsault, even though traditionally in South Africa, it's an earlier ripener, with these vineyards being so old and the skins being quite thick on these vineyards, we had to wait for those tannins to ripen. So one of the Cinsault vineyards and one of the earlier Cab vineyards do traditionally ripen at the same time. And that's when we do the co-fermentation, meaning that they're fermenting in the same vat together.
Yes, Kathy's just asking a question. She's recently tasted quite a few vintages of Chateau Libertas and Zonneblom from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and found them a little bit sweeter, I suppose, on the palate than these wines. I think, personally, from my experience, I've also tasted a lot of those wines, and also tasted quite a few older straight Cinsauts. And Cinsault is really a variety, I think, that over time develops this perceived sweetness. It's kind of a glycerol character that comes out in the wine. And it's really something that's quite unique to Cinsault. So I think that's something that does, as you age Cinsault, it starts to come out, that kind of glycerol. It's a perception of sweetness on the palate. Yeah.
Even if analytically it's bone dry. And I mean, an interesting converse to that is, sometimes when you have really old sweet wines, like old Sauternes, they actually taste drier than they are. So it's funny that some wines have a perception of sweetness as they age, and then other wines have a perception of dryness as they age.
Great. So we're going to move on to the 2016 dry red. So the first year of the grape drought. And here I think you'll see a slight difference in style, like you did with the Chardonnays. We want the wines to reflect the vintage. And 2016 was a dry year, particularly so in Franschhoek and Wellington, where the Cinsault vineyards are. So immediately on the palate, on the nose, you'll pick up a little bit more dark fruit. a little bit more of that kind of Christmas spice, I suppose, that we found in the Franschhoek Cinsault. And then you'll find again on the palate a little bit more density, a little bit more texture from the vintage, that natural concentration that we had in the 2016 vintage. So yeah, winemaking wise, Andrea, there was no difference in this vintage.
Yeah, I mean, the reality was, I remember specifically in the luxury portion of it, the thickest skins that year, it was almost a skin to juice ratio of Cabernet Sauvignon. So we had to wait for those skins to not taste like leather. You know, they had to soften, they had to lose their astringency, and Cinsault in that year, it was actually very lucky we planned on co-fermenting it with the Cabernet, because it took a very long time to ripen to that point where the grapes tasted good themselves. You know, ripening is not just about sugar levels. It's about the flavor profiles, the way the skins taste, the way the pips taste. There's a lot to choosing when to pick grapes.
Great. Yeah. So I think another really interesting expression. A little bit denser, a little bit more rich, a little bit maybe more powerful due to the first vintage of the drought. But yeah, I think a wine that still has a wonderful balance to it. So next we'll do the taste of 2017 dry red. So Andrew, maybe 2017. How did that come out in terms of expression in the vineyards and the wine?
So I spoke about 2017 as being a bounce back year. You know, when we were speaking about the Chardonnays, and it was the same here. But what was quite interesting is the oldest vineyards bounced back quicker. You'll see a reduction in the Cabernet Franc in 2017, and that is because the Cabernet Franc is the youngest portion going into here. So just a little bit longer for the Cabernet Franc to bounce back, because for a lot of our vineyards, you know, it's a set block. We get what we get. It's a reflection of the vintage. So there again, it's not just meant to taste like the vintage, but the amount of grapes that we get for the different parcels that go into this are also a reflection of the vintage because of the yield that they're giving us. And then I think that's just a great example to show how it would have been done, you know, 100 years ago. They didn't necessarily have the luxury of choosing how the blend would shift. It would always be like, this is what nature gave me, and this is what I'm working with. Yeah. And obviously, we'd like to enhance what nature gives us with the control that we have in the cellar, of making sure that we're only working with the best, you know, sorting out things that maybe aren't what we consider suitable for the vintage. But I think that you see the shift in the blend is definitely a reflection of 2017.
Yeah, great. And has anything changed in the winemaking over the, you know, since 2015? Have you altered anything, or has it been quite consistent between the vintages so far? Yep. For the dry red, as you learned as a winemaker to work with these grapes?
There's definitely been consistency, and what we've been loving to experiment with a bit is actually, again, looking at inspirations from the past, but working with a bit of full cluster in the Cabernet Franc specifically, and that really enhances it. It moves it from that black tea character into, again, that bergamot character, really lifting a citrus element, a very floral element to it. And that's definitely been consistent all the way through. So it was a little bit of risk at first, just because we didn't have a lot of experience with working with that. Obviously, that's how we work with our Syrahs, with a character that I absolutely adore. And so I'm very happy with that risk we took with the Cabernet Franc.
Cool. I mean, Kathy puts it very well. So it's old soul wine. So they're wines that we want them to have an authenticity to them. They must speak of South African heritage, but made with clean, modern techniques. So Andrea often talks about it when you go to a great restaurant where the chef has taken a classic dish and deconstructed it and then reconstructed it in his own modern interpretation. And that's really what we're trying to do here. So to honor these wines, but do it in a modern way where they have a precision to them, they have a finesse to them, a cleanliness to them, but they still are authentic and have all those amazing elements to them. So yeah. Pauline is asking, is there a specific style that we're aiming for? Or is it really just whatever the vintage gives?
Look, I mean, stylistically for us, one of the most important elements of it is, I think, the tannin structure of it. We love those sophisticated tannins. You know, they're long, they're not chunky. They're ripe tannins, but the wine is not heavy. I think that's very important for us. And the fact that you definitely get a complete wine out of this blend. So, you know, where Cabernet might be more long and need more time, although this wine will age incredibly well. I mean, tasting the wine in your glass right now, you know it'll improve with time, but with that Cinsault element in there, it actually, it fills it out now.
Yep.
And as these wines age, different elements will show. So the Cinsault does tend to show more in its youth, but then the Cabernet structure is what's going to help it live.
Yep. And
I think that's definitely the, you know, the style we're aiming for is that that sophistication, but it's not standoffish.
Yeah, great. Cool. So yeah, so now onto the 2018 dry red. This is the vintage we're releasing now. And personally, this is the wine I'm most excited about in this release. So Andrea, maybe just chat here. We have again a slight shift in the blend makeup. Maybe was there a specific reason for that, or is it just with the way that we felt the wine tasted best? Or
yeah, so in 2019, the phenolic ripeness, you know, the kind of elusive phenolic ripeness that people talk about, but we experienced that at a much earlier point. So we mentioned in 2016, it took longer for the Cinsault to ripen, but the Cabernets in 2018 were more available at a earlier point. And what I think that absolutely lent to the wine is we were actually getting a bit of mid palate out of Cabernet. And as I mentioned with the previous wine, you're tasting the Cinsault was giving it that lushness in the previous wine, but we felt that the Cinsault was too high in this wine. The same way we kind of hold back on Viognier in our white blend that we make. If the Cinsault was too high here, it would become too opulent, too kind of in your face lush. And just to keep that sophistication there and to really just showcase, you know, this being what we want to be as a benchmark wine for South Africa, we did hold back a little bit on the Cinsault just to keep that sophisticated edge.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I mean, I just love smelling this wine. Honestly, it's just so it just draws you in. It's really just an incredible vintage. So for me, yeah, I get kind of goosebumps smelling this vintage. Really, it's a really, for me, profound and very, very special vintage of the dry red.
And sorry, something we actually haven't even spoken about. We're releasing this a year later now, so this is why we didn't release a dry red last year, was because we were holding this back another year longer. So just like with the Cinsauts, where I was talking about respecting the heritage of the wine and the heritage of the vineyards, we wanted to hold this back in bottle an extra year. So it was 1 year in 500-liter barrel, 1 year in upright vats, and 2 years in bottle before releasing it. And for us, that's what's taken this to the next level. This is my absolute favorite release of this wine. It gives me goosebumps. And it takes me back, you know, to the wines that we were inspired by as well. You know, I feel like I'm tasting Demi Bailey's words, you know, and tasting those old wines that inspired us.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, so yeah, hopefully, you find pleasure in them as well. I think particularly these are wines that do need air, they do need time, they do need you know, to either be left in bottle for several years, or if you're as impatient as we are often, open it, give it a lot of air within a decanter, and see what it has to give. They do have a harmony. I think we have a house style where we try to bottle wines that have finesse and balance to them. It's firm. There's a lot of tannin and structure, but the wine is great balance. It's not rough. It's not alcoholic. It's not over oaked. There's a great balance to it. So I honestly think this is a really serious wine, but it has a great enjoyment factor right now to it. So yeah, so thank you guys. It's been yeah, an awesome hour we've spent with you. I really appreciate you guys all spending a Friday evening with us. It's an honor. Thank you for all the comments. The feedback has been brilliant. As I mentioned, we're releasing these wines next week on the 18th. So you will expect to receive a mailer from Keo and Nicola. But if you want to get in early, there is particularly of a couple of the wines, very limited amounts, and we've got already a lot of interest from, especially our overseas customers, the importers overseas. So if you're keen, just get a sneaky email into to Keo or Nicola, and we can reserve some stock for you. But other than that, we will be we'll be sending out a mailer on the 18th next week, Friday, to everybody. Yeah, cheers to you all, and hopefully we get to share some wine with you either in the Swartland or in Franschhoek before too long. So yeah, so cool. Thank you, everybody. Keep safe, keep well, and enjoy.
Cheers.
Bye bye, everybody.